At my son's wedding, I realized I wasn't a guest, I was a lesson someone wanted to teach. I stood beside the long reception table, the scent of butter and roasted herbs filling the air, the kind of warmth that's supposed to feel comforting, like home, like family, like everything I had spent my life building for this very day, and yet something about the way people avoided my eyes told me I was standing in the wrong place, or maybe I had been placed there on purpose, just slightly off-center, just far enough to be seen but not welcomed, and I remember adjusting the soft blue fabric of my dress, the one I had chosen weeks ago because Michael once told me it made me look elegant, back when he still noticed things like that, back when I still felt like I belonged in his life instead of orbiting it like a distant memory, and I told myself I was overthinking, that weddings are chaotic, that people get busy, that maybe Vanessa was just stressed, because brides are allowed to be, everyone says that, they excuse everything under that word, stress, but then she walked up to me. With that perfect smile, the kind that never reached her eyes, and she leaned in just close enough that no one else could hear her voice when she said, "You should try the mashed potatoes," like it was a suggestion, like it was polite, like it was harmless, and I nodded because that's what I've always done. I nod, I accommodate, I make things easier for everyone else, and I reached for the serving spoon, but before I could even process what was happening, there was this sudden shift, this quick, deliberate movement that didn't belong in a moment like that, and I froze, not from pain, not even from surprise, but from the realization that this wasn't an accident, that everything about this moment had been arranged down to the smallest detail, and when I straightened up, when I wiped my face with the neatly folded napkin I had placed there myself minutes earlier, I noticed the silence first, not loud, not dramatic, just a thin, uncomfortable quiet that settled over the nearest tables. People looking down at their plates, pretending to laugh, pretending not to see, and I searched for Michael without turning my head too quickly, because I didn't want to make a scene. I never make scenes, and when our eyes finally met across the room, he didn't look shocked, he didn't look confused, he looked still, like someone watching something unfold exactly the way it was supposed to, and that was the moment something inside me shifted, not shattered, not broken, just moved, like a piece sliding quietly into place after years of not quite fitting, and I realized then that this day, this beautiful, carefully planned celebration with its white roses and crystal glasses and soft golden lighting, was never meant to include me, not really. I was just part of the setting, something useful, something temporary, something that could be moved or dismissed without consequence, and as I stood there, dabbing the last trace of embarrassment from my skin, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest, not anger, not even sadness, but clarity, cold and steady, the kind that doesn't ask questions, the kind that doesn't need answers, and I understood, with a certainty that surprised even me, that whatever happened next would not be decided by them anymore. I stepped away from the table before anyone could say a word, not quickly, not in a way that would draw attention, but with the same quiet control I had practiced for most of my life, the kind that comes from years of choosing peace over pride, and as I walked across the reception hall I could feel the weight of the room shift behind me, conversations lowering just enough to acknowledge something had happened without anyone daring to name it, the polished wooden floor reflecting the soft glow of the chandeliers above, everything still beautiful, still perfectly arranged, as if nothing had been disturbed at all, and I remember thinking how strange it was that a place could look so flawless while something inside it had already begun to rot, and I found my seat, the one at the edge of the room, not at the family table where I had always imagined I would be, but near a group of distant relatives who smiled politely without quite knowing who I was supposed to be, and I sat down, smoothing the fabric of my dress again, pressing my napkin neatly across my lap, as if maintaining order in small things could somehow steady the larger imbalance that had just revealed itself, and I listened as the music resumed, a gentle piano melody filling the silence that no one wanted to acknowledge, and I watched as Vanessa moved through the room, radiant, confident, laughing lightly as guests congratulated her, her hand resting on Michael's arm as though everything was exactly as it should be, and he leaned in close to her, saying something that made her smile widen, and I waited, just for a moment, for him to look toward me again, to show even the smallest sign that he understood what had just happened, that he recognized the line that had been crossed, but he did not, his attention never leaving her, and that absence spoke louder than anything he could have said, and I realized then that this was not a misunderstanding, not a moment of poor judgment, but something far more deliberate, something that had been building quietly over time while I convinced myself that distance was normal, that change was natural, that love simply looked different as children grew older, and I thought back to the weeks leading up to this day, the subtle exclusions I had dismissed, the conversations I had not been included in, the decisions that had been made without my knowledge, the way details of the wedding had been shared with me only after they were finalized, as if I were an afterthought rather than a mother, and I saw it clearly. Now, each small moment fitting together with quiet precision, not random, not accidental, but intentional, like pieces of a pattern I had refused to recognize until it was impossible to ignore, and as I sat there, surrounded by laughter that no longer felt like it belonged to me, I felt something settle deeper within me, not anger, not hurt, but a calm awareness that I had been slowly repositioned in my own family without ever being told, and that what happened moments ago was simply the first time it had been made visible, undeniable, impossible to excuse, and I folded my hands gently in my lap, lifting my chin just slightly, because if there was one thing I understood now, it was that dignity was not something they could take from me unless I handed it over, and I had no intention of doing that again. The speeches began not long after, a sequence of carefully timed words meant to celebrate love, family, and new beginnings, and I sat there listening as one voice after another painted a picture of unity that felt strangely distant from where I was seated. The best man spoke about loyalty, about standing by each other through every season of life, and the guests laughed at the right moments, nodding along as if those words were universal truths, and then it was Vanessa's turn. She rose gracefully, holding her glass with practiced elegance, her voice soft but clear enough to reach every corner of the room, and she spoke about building a future, about choosing the right people to surround yourself with, about leaving behind anything that might hold you back from becoming the person you were meant to be. And there was a pause there, just a fraction longer than necessary, her eyes sweeping across the room before settling briefly in my direction, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for me to understand, and the room responded with applause, warm and approving, as if they had just witnessed something heartfelt rather than something carefully measured, and I realized then that this moment, like everything else today, had layers, meanings tucked beneath polished words, messages delivered in ways that could not be challenged without making oneself appear unreasonable, and I felt a strange sense of clarity wash over me as I replayed her words in my mind. The emphasis on moving forward, on surrounding yourself with the right people, on knowing when to let go, it was all there, hidden in plain sight, and I thought about how easy it must be to rewrite a narrative when enough people are willing to accept it, how quickly history can be reshaped when silence fills the spaces where truth should stand, and I glanced around the room again, at the guests who smiled and clinked their glasses, at the distant relatives who barely recognized me, at the carefully arranged seating chart that had placed me exactly where I would be least visible, and I understood that I had not just been moved physically, I had been repositioned in a story that no longer required me to have a voice, and when Michael stood to speak, I allowed myself one final moment of hope, a quiet, fleeting thought that perhaps he would acknowledge me, even in the smallest way, that he would bridge the distance that had grown between us, but his words were directed entirely toward his new life, toward the future he was building, toward the partnership he now stood within. And I listened as he thanked the people who had supported him, colleagues, friends, even Vanessa's family, names flowing easily from his lips, and when he finished, when the room filled with applause once more, I realized that my name had not been spoken, not once, not even as an afterthought, and it was in that absence that everything became undeniable, not because I needed recognition, but because the omission was too precise to be accidental, and I sat there, hands still folded neatly in my lap, my expression unchanged, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to interpret, only the quiet, steady understanding that the role I had once held in my son's life had been quietly erased, not with confrontation, not with explanation, but with something far more effective, indifference, and as the applause faded and the music swelled again, I felt something within me settle completely into place, a calm certainty that whatever came next would not be shaped by their version of the story, but by the choices I had yet to make. After the applause faded and the music swelled back into the room, people began to rise from their seats, chairs sliding softly against polished floors, glasses being lifted, conversations blooming again as if nothing unusual had taken place, and I remained seated for a moment longer, watching it all unfold with a kind of detached clarity that felt unfamiliar but strangely steady, like I had stepped just outside of the moment and could finally see it without the blur of expectation, and I realized how carefully everything had been arranged, not just the flowers or the lighting or the seating chart, but the roles each person was meant to play. Who would be celebrated, who would be acknowledged, and who would quietly disappear into the background without causing disruption. And I stood up slowly, smoothing my dress once more, not out of habit this time but as a small act of control, something I could still choose. And I made my way toward the edge of the room where a large window overlooked the garden, the evening light casting long shadows across the lawn where guests would soon gather for photographs, and I could see the photographer setting up, adjusting angles, calling out instructions, preparing to capture images that would later be framed as perfect memories, and I wondered what those pictures would show, who would be included, who would be cropped out, and how easily a moment could be preserved without ever revealing the truth that existed just beyond the frame. And I felt a presence beside me before I heard the voice, a soft, careful tone that did not quite belong to the confident rhythm of the celebration, and when I turned, it was one of the event staff, a young woman holding a clipboard, her expression polite but slightly hesitant, and she said there had been a small adjustment to the family photo schedule, that I would not be needed for the first round of portraits, that there would be another opportunity later if time allowed, and she smiled as she said it, as though offering reassurance, but her eyes flickered with something closer to discomfort, as if she knew she was delivering a message that had not originated with her, and I nodded, of course I nodded, because by now the pattern was clear, adjustments, omissions, quiet redirections, all carried out with a level of politeness that made resistance seem unnecessary, even unreasonable, and I thanked her, because that is what I have always done. I thank people even when they are simply the messengers of decisions I was never meant to question, and she left quickly, relieved perhaps to have completed her task. And I turned back to the window, watching as Vanessa stepped outside, her dress catching the light, her laughter carrying easily across the space, and Michael followed just behind her, his hand resting at the small of her back, guiding her forward as though that was now his only direction, and I stood there, not hidden, not exactly excluded, but positioned in a way that made my absence from those photographs feel natural, almost logical, and I realized then that this was how it had been done, not with confrontation, not with harsh words spoken in private, but with a series of small, precise decisions that gradually shifted me out of the center of my own story, and I felt no urge to interrupt, no need to step forward and insist on my place, because something within me had already moved past that point, and as I watched them pose for the camera, smiling under the soft glow of the evening sky, I understood with a quiet certainty that this was not just about a single day or a single moment. This was about a future that no longer had space for me in the way I once believed it would, and instead of feeling lost, I felt something else begin to take shape, something calm, deliberate, and patient, the kind of resolve that does not rush, that does not announce itself, but simply waits for the right moment to act. As the evening moved forward and the golden light outside began to fade into a deeper shade of blue, I found myself stepping away from the window, not because I was asked to, but because I understood that my place was no longer tied to where others expected me to stand, and I walked slowly along the edge of the room, past tables filled with half-finished meals and quiet conversations, the soft clinking of silverware and glass blending into a steady background hum, and I let my hand rest briefly on the back of an empty chair, grounding myself in something simple, something real, and it was in that moment that memories began to surface, not all at once, but in fragments, like small pieces of a life I had once believed was unshakable, and I saw Michael as a boy again, no more than 8 years old, sitting at our kitchen table with his homework spread out in front of him, frustrated, tired, ready to give up, and I remembered pulling a chair beside him, guiding him through each problem, reminding him that patience would take him further than anger ever could, and I remembered the nights I worked late, the early mornings I woke before sunrise, making sure everything he needed was in place before he even opened his eyes, lunches packed, clothes pressed, every detail handled so that he could move through the world without worry, and I thought about the sacrifices that had never been spoken out loud, the opportunities set aside, the quiet decisions made over and over again to put his future ahead of my own comfort, and I realized that none of those memories carried resentment, not even now, because at the time they had been choices made with love, not obligation, and yet standing there, in a room filled with people celebrating the life he was building, I could not ignore the distance between who we had been and who we had become, a distance that had not appeared overnight but had grown slowly, almost invisibly, shaped by conversations that never happened, by moments when silence replaced honesty, and I began to see Vanessa not as the cause of that distance, but as Someone who had simply recognized it and used it to her advantage. Someone who understood that influence does not always come from force, but from positioning, from knowing where to stand and when to speak. And I recalled small moments from the past few years that I had dismissed at the time. The way she would answer questions directed at Michael before he had a chance to respond. The way decisions about holidays or visits were framed as already agreed upon, leaving no room for discussion. The subtle shifts that seemed harmless on their own but, when placed together, formed a pattern that was impossible to overlook. And I realized that while I had been holding on to the version of my son I knew, she had been shaping the version he was becoming, and I had allowed that to happen by stepping back, by choosing not to challenge what felt uncomfortable, by convincing myself that maintaining peace was more important than asserting my place. And as I stood there, watching the room continue without me in ways that now felt intentional rather than incidental, I felt no anger toward her, not anymore, because understanding has a way of quieting emotions that once felt overwhelming, and instead I felt a steady awareness of my own role in what had unfolded, not as someone who had caused it, but as someone who had underestimated the importance of staying present, of being seen, of not allowing myself to fade into the background of my own life. And that awareness did not weaken me. It clarified something essential, something I had not fully recognized until now, that respect is not something that can be assumed simply because it was once given. It is something that must be protected, quietly, but firmly. And as that thought settled into place, I straightened my shoulders slightly, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement of a truth I could no longer ignore, that whatever came next would require a different version of me, one who understood the value of presence, of boundaries, and of choosing when to step forward instead of stepping aside. It was near the back hallway, just beyond the main reception area where the music softened and the noise faded into something distant, that I first noticed her watching me, not in the curious way guests sometimes observe strangers, but with a kind of quiet recognition, as though she understood more than she was meant to say. And when I stepped aside to let a server pass with a tray of empty glasses, she moved closer, adjusting the strap of her name badge as if giving herself a reason to approach, and her voice, when she spoke, was careful, almost measured. "Mrs. Hayes, I hope you are doing all right," and I nodded, offering the same composed smile I had worn all evening, because there was no reason to suggest otherwise. And yet she did not leave. She hesitated, glancing briefly toward the main hall before lowering her voice just slightly, not enough to be secretive, but enough to signal that what she was about to say did not belong to the open space around us. And she mentioned something about the seating arrangements earlier that day, how there had been last-minute changes, how certain names had been moved, not due to availability, but by request, and I listened without interrupting, my expression unchanged, even as the pieces began to align with a clarity that no longer surprised me. And she continued, explaining that the original plan had included me at the family table, that my place had been set alongside Michael's, that it had been printed, confirmed, and only hours before the ceremony had it been revised. And I did not ask who made that decision, because I already knew. The pattern had become too consistent to ignore. And she added, almost as an afterthought, that there had been similar adjustments to the photo schedule, certain names quietly removed from key groupings, certain moments restructured to appear seamless. And I thanked her, gently, because I understood that she was offering me something more valuable than information. She was offering confirmation. And as she stepped away, returning to her duties, I remained where I was, absorbing what had just been said, not with shock, but with a steady acceptance that felt almost inevitable. And I thought back to the earlier hours of the day, the way I had arrived with a sense of anticipation, the way I had believed that my presence would naturally be woven into the fabric of the celebration. And I realized now that what I had assumed to be inclusion had, in fact, been carefully edited, adjusted in ways that maintained the appearance of respect while systematically removing any real significance. And I felt no urge to confront anyone, no desire to disrupt the carefully maintained harmony of the evening, because confrontation would only serve to draw attention without changing the underlying truth. And instead I allowed that understanding to settle into something more purposeful, something that did not react, but observed, that did not argue, but prepared. And I recognized that influence, like the kind Vanessa had demonstrated so skillfully, was not about volume or visibility. It was about control, about knowing which levers to pull and when, about shaping outcomes long before they became visible to anyone else. And for the first time, I considered what it would mean to operate with that same level of awareness. Not to mirror her actions, but to reclaim my own position with intention rather than assumption. and as I walked back toward the reception hall, the music growing louder with each step, I no longer felt like someone searching for a place within the room, but someone who had begun to understand the structure of the room itself, the invisible lines that defined who belonged and who did not, and that understanding, quiet as it was, felt like the beginning of something far more significant than anything that had been taken from me that evening. When I stepped back into the reception hall, nothing had changed on the surface. The music was louder now, a lively rhythm filling the space as guests gathered near the dance floor, laughter rising easily, glasses raised, conversations flowing as if the evening had unfolded exactly as planned, and for a brief moment I stood there at the edge, watching it all with a quiet stillness that felt different from before, not uncertain, not searching, but aware, as though I was seeing the same room through a lens that had finally come into focus, and I noticed how people moved, who gravitated toward whom, who held attention without asking for it, and who, like me, existed just outside the center of it all. And I realized that this entire evening had been carefully guided, not just by schedules or timelines, but by influence, by subtle direction that shaped what was seen and what was left unnoticed, and as I walked slowly along the perimeter, I allowed myself to observe without reacting, to take in every detail without the need to respond to it, and I saw Vanessa again, standing among a group of guests, her posture relaxed, her expression warm, every movement controlled yet effortless, and I understood now that none of it was accidental. Not the smile, not the tone of her voice, not even the way she positioned herself in every conversation, always at the center, always just visible enough to hold attention without appearing to seek it, and I thought about how easily that kind of presence can reshape a room, how it can redirect focus without confrontation, how it can create a version of reality that others accept without question, and I felt no resentment toward her in that moment, only a clear recognition of the role she had chosen and the precision with which she played it. And then my eyes found Michael again, standing just a few feet away from her, his body angled slightly toward hers even when he spoke to others, as though his sense of direction had quietly aligned with hers, and I wondered when that shift had taken place, when the boy who once looked to me for guidance had begun to take his cues from someone else, not because he had been forced, but because it had been easier, more seamless, less complicated than holding two loyalties at once, and I understood that now, not as a betrayal in the way I might have once seen it, but as a choice, one that had been made gradually, reinforced over time, until it became the natural order of things, and as that realization settled, I felt something within me steady even further, not a reaction, not a surge of emotion, but a quiet alignment with a truth I could no longer ignore, that the place I had once held could not be reclaimed by asking for it, by reminding anyone of the past, or by waiting for recognition that had already been withdrawn, and instead it would require something entirely different, something deliberate, something that did not depend on their acknowledgement, and I paused near one of the side tables, resting my fingertips lightly against the cool surface, grounding myself once more in the present, and I allowed a single thought to take shape, clear and undeniable, that I would not spend another moment trying to fit into a space that had already been redefined without me, and that whatever came next would not be guided by what I had lost tonight, but by what I was now fully prepared to do with what remained, and as the music carried on and the celebration continued around me, I no longer felt like someone who had been pushed aside, but someone who had finally stepped far enough back to see the entire design, and in that distance, I found something far more valuable than a place at any table. I found control over what I would choose to do next. By the time the evening began to slow, when the music softened and the dance floor gradually thinned, I had already made my decision, not in a dramatic moment, not with any outward sign that something had shifted, but quietly, with the same deliberate calm that had carried me through the entire night. And I moved through the room one last time, not to say goodbye, not to seek acknowledgement, but simply to observe what I had once believed was still mine, the familiar faces, the distant laughter, the carefully constructed warmth of a celebration that no longer included me in any meaningful way, and I noticed how easy it was to leave without being stopped, how no one called my name, how no one questioned my absence as I stepped past the final row of tables and toward the exit, and that absence of resistance confirmed everything I needed to know, not with cruelty, but with clarity, and outside, the air was cooler, the night settling in with a quiet stillness that felt more honest than anything I had experienced inside, and I paused for a moment beneath the soft glow of the venue lights, taking in the silence, allowing it to settle around me like a steady breath, and I reached into my bag, not searching, but knowing exactly what I had brought with me, a small envelope, sealed. Unremarkable to anyone else, but carefully prepared long before this evening had fully revealed itself, and I turned it over once in my hand, feeling the weight of it, not in paper, but in meaning, and I thought about the months leading up to this day, the subtle changes I had sensed, the quiet adjustments that had not gone entirely unnoticed, even if I had chosen not to confront them at the time, and I realized now that a part of me had already begun preparing, not out of suspicion, but out of instinct, the kind that comes from years of understanding how quickly circumstances can shift when you are no longer at the center of someone else's priorities, and I walked back inside just long enough to place the envelope at the reception desk, addressing it simply, without explanation, because explanations were no longer necessary, and I knew it would reach the right hands at the right time, not immediately, not in a way that would interrupt the evening, but later, when the celebration had ended and the quiet realities of the next day began to take shape, and as I stepped outside again, I did not look back, not because I was trying to prove something, but because there was nothing left behind that required my attention, and I made my way toward the parking lot, the sound of distant music fading with each step, replaced by the steady rhythm of my own thoughts, clear, measured, and finally aligned, and I understood that what I had done tonight was not a reaction, not an attempt to reclaim something that had already been taken, but the beginning of something far more controlled, something that would unfold in its own time, without noise, without confrontation, but with a certainty that did not need to be announced to be effective, and as I reached my car and paused for just a moment before opening the door, I felt a quiet sense of completion settle over me, not because everything had been resolved, but because I had finally stepped into a position where resolution would no longer depend on anyone else, and in that stillness, I allowed myself a single, steady breath, knowing that whatever came next would not be shaped by the events of this night, but by the choices I had already set in motion. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of quiet morning that follows a carefully orchestrated celebration, when everything looks the same on the surface but something underneath has already shifted, and I woke at my usual time, not because I had slept well, but because routine has a way of holding you steady when everything else begins to realign, and I moved through my kitchen slowly, the soft hum of the coffee maker filling the silence, sunlight filtering through the window in thin, pale lines, and for a moment it felt like any other day, simple, predictable, untouched by what had unfolded the night before, and yet there was a difference, not in the space around me, but in the way I occupied it, with a calm certainty that had not been there before, and I sat at the table, wrapping my hands around the warmth of the mug, allowing myself to think, not about the humiliation, not about the silence, but about what had already been set in motion, and I knew that by now the envelope would have been found, opened perhaps with casual curiosity at first, maybe even dismissed as something routine, until the contents made it clear that it was anything but, and I could imagine the shift that would follow, the moment when understanding replaced assumption, when the structure they believed was secure revealed itself to be far more fragile than they had ever considered, and I did not need to witness it to know it would happen, because I had spent enough years building, protecting, and maintaining what they now took for granted, and I understood exactly where its strength came from and where its vulnerabilities had always been, and later that morning, when the phone finally rang, I did not rush to answer it, I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, before reaching for it with the same steady composure that had guided me through the previous evening, and when I heard Michael's voice on the other end, there was something in it I had not heard in a long time, not authority, not certainty, but hesitation, the kind that comes when a person realizes that the ground beneath them is no longer as stable as they believed, and he asked questions, careful at first, then more direct, about documents, about decisions, about things he had assumed were fixed, and I listened without interrupting, because there was no need to correct him, no need to explain every detail, the facts would do that on their own, and when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, measured, not unkind, but unmistakably firm, and I told him that everything had been arranged exactly as I saw fit, that nothing had been taken away from him, only reassigned according to choices that had already been made, not by me alone, but by the way I had been treated, by the way I had been repositioned, and there was a silence after that, longer than any we had shared before, and in that silence I understood that he was beginning to see what I had seen, not just the outcome, but the process that led to it, and I did not need to say anything more, because this was not a moment for argument or reconciliation, it was simply a moment of recognition, and as I ended the call, placing the phone Back on the table with quiet finality, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction in their confusion or their concern, only a steady sense of balance restored, and I looked out the window once more, the day fully awake. Now, ordinary in every visible way, and I understood that what had changed was not the world around me, but my place within it, no longer defined by where I was invited, or where I was placed, but by the boundaries I had finally chosen to set, and I took a slow breath, allowing that understanding to settle completely, knowing that from this point forward, respect would not be something I hoped for, but something I ensured, quietly, firmly, and without ever needing to ask for it again.